And that brings us to the second in a series of interviews this week in which we look at how the world might respond to Iran's nuclear program and the prospect of harsher sanctions. Tonight, we look at the view from China, and for that we are joined by John Delury. He is the Associate Director of the Asia Society's Center on U.S. China Relations. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, let me ask you first, how significant is China's trade relationship with Iran, and then how might that influence China's decision to go along with any tougher trade sanctions?
Well, in the grand scheme of China's economic relationships, it's not that big. But of course, the important thing is that it's about oil. Iran is China's second major source of crude oil, surpassed only by Saudi Arabia and about on par with Angola. So that's a major natural resource supplier for China, the number 2 consumer of crude oil, and Iran has the world's second largest reserves. So there's a compatibility there. Related to oil, there's a lot of infrastructural investment, whether it's mostly in the transportation section, that China is putting money in, has over 100 companies active in Iran. Again, most of it related in some way to the flow of oil. But you know, it is an important economic relationship and beneficial to both sides.
So even though it's possible that China could suffer if there is these stiffer trade sanctions that are put into place, is there any way that China would go against, say, the will of these 5 other nations?
China's not going to be it doesn't want to be seen as the outlier. So it doesn't want to be the only one sort of defending Tehran. It wants to be right in the middle. But it does have major economic interests, as does Russia. Russia and China form a natural kind of block here. I think both of them are going to be pushing to water down any sort of sanctions, the language. I think it depends to some extent on really how bad the evidence is against Iran. And some of this the public might not know. There's a whole debate going on among intelligence agencies around the world. So to some extent, it'll depend on what China is shown and how convinced they are. And so there's a measure of just how incriminating the evidence is. But a priori, they do not want to sign off on major sanctions.
Well, let me be more blunt. I mean, China has veto power inside the UN Security Council. Is it possible that it would exercise that opportunity and veto?
China very much does not like to exercise that veto power. It's not.
How do you avoid that then?
Well, it's going to be negotiating with the U.S., with the EU countries, probably in a position close to Russia, so that again you water down, you mitigate the language of any sanctions, so that there's some kind of symbolic, with some real-term impact. Sanctions language, but it doesn't start to affect the core kind of economic interests. You don't cut off refined oil sales, for example, to Iran. China is probably selling refined oil. That would be a major impact item that China wouldn't want to see included.
And China's willingness to go ahead or go along with sanctions against North Korea, is that any indicator as to where they may stand when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, I mean, the two are inextricably linked. China's gone along to some extent with the buildup of a more robust sanctions regime against North Korea. That gives the U.S. and its allies some room to say, hey, look, you're already doing this on your border. You need to join us to do this on Iran. At the same time, they don't like sanctions. They don't think in the long term they're effective. They don't think they're effective with North Korea, and they have a huge trading relationship with North Korea. So it's really not their strategy. They're doing this to be a good player. They're doing it to stay in the mainstream of the UN Security Council and to keep U.S. China relations on a good tack, but it's not their instinct.
Going to leave it there. John Delury, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.